Okay, so I'm just going to start things right here for everybody. I want to say a very hearty and healthy good morning to everyone. We hope that all are well. And my name is Loren Weiss, and along with my wife, next to me, Andrea, we are very pleased to be hosting today's webinar presentation, Return to Life with Rabbi Moshe Cohn, head of the Jewish World section at Yad Vashem's International School for Holocaust Studies. If you're having technical issues, please call Aaron Feinberg, who is in the confirmation email you got, or enter something in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to help you resolve them. Also, throughout the presentation, please enter your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom right, and Rabbi Cohn will answer them at the end of his presentation. You can also share any family stories about the Holocaust that our community should know about, and we're happy to keep them confidential. And we've just heard so many wonderful stories from our community. For me and Andrea, in regard to this event, it is hard to find the words to express our gratitude and profound appreciation to have so many friends and neighbors join us for what we think you'll find poignant, intellectually, and spiritually uplifting, something we can all use. Those of us alive today will be the last of our generations to have met a Holocaust survivor or have firsthand stories of our own families during that time. When viewed over the 200 generations of our people's history, we on this call just missed it ourselves by a mere filament of time. We're also the last generations to have met the righteous among the nations, the non-Jews who risked their lives and that of their family, or the liberating soldiers who were the first to walk into the camps and discover their horror. We are helped immensely in this journey by an organization like Yad Vashem, the world's Holocaust Remembrance Center, which is the global leader in Holocaust commemoration, education, and learning. Importantly, please stay tuned for more on a special online event we are planning, which will occur on Sunday, November 8th, where we will be honoring two of Yad Vashem's most prominent executives, Avner Shalev and Shaya Ben Yehuda, who combined have over 50 years of service to Yad Vashem. We will be sure to keep you updated on this exceptional event. Before we turn it over to Rabbi Cohn, I'd like to turn it over for a minute to my dear friend Lenny Wilf, who is the chairman of the board for the American Society for Yad Vashem. Lenny has been a mentor to me in my philanthropy, and the Wilf family sets a magnificent standard in philanthropy today, from Jewish causes, local causes, health education, and within their adopted city of Minneapolis, where we all hope the Vikings will return and defeat the Bears and Packers in the near future. We're delighted to have Lenny join us for some remarks, but don't ask Lenny about the Timberwolves, because his answer will be no comment. Lenny, your family is one of the most significant financial supporters of Yad Vashem. Thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you for a few remarks and to then introduce Rabbi Cohn's program.
Thank you, Loren, and Andrea too. Thank you for inviting me and for organizing today's event. To each of you who are participating, Loren, I have known you for many years, and as the son of Holocaust survivors, I truly appreciate your efforts to join me in advancing Yad Vashem's deeply important mission. Today, we are in an era where paradoxically, both Holocaust denial and interest in the lessons and legacy of the Holocaust are at an all-time high. Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center, is the global leader in Holocaust commemoration and education. Through its landmark Holocaust History Museum, comprehensive archives, and digitization of millions of documents and survival testimonies, the International School for Holocaust Studies, and so much more, Yad Vashem tells 6 million stories of the 6 million Jews who were murdered, so that they are never forgotten and the past is never repeated. I hope that once we can all travel again, you will all plan to visit Yad Vashem, whether it's your first, second, or multiple visit there. Loren and I promise you, we will organize a very special visit for you. And with that, I'm proud to turn the program over to Rabbi Moshe Cohn. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to share in this very special occasion. I'm excited to be a part of it, but I'm mostly excited to learn and share with you. You know, we at Yad Vashem spend a lot of time remembering, and we often ask ourselves, why do we remember? Why do we have to spend so much time and be so focused on something that happened so long ago? Well, of course, one reason, as Mr. Wolf mentioned, is by remembering the past, we hope not to repeat it. Well, look, I wish that were the case. I'm speaking to you from Israel, and unfortunately, 200 kilometers from where I sit now, there's a nation that's gassing its own people, or recently had been. So I don't know if the memory of the Holocaust can prevent tragedy from happening in the future. So then, if that's the case, why exactly do we remember? And I think we remember because it's our lives. We are going through, for example, we're going through now, all of us here in Israel, this disease is keeping us from synagogue. It's preventing many people from leaving their home. Simple luxuries that we took for granted so often, like going to a restaurant, are precluded from us now. And I'm not in any way saying that what we're going through is a Holocaust. Of course it's not. Nothing like it, nothing near it, but nevertheless, it's a challenge. Nevertheless, it's something that causes us anxiety. It causes us angst, if you will. And I wonder, we all wonder, how do you deal with it? How do you come from a difficult place and deal with it better? What qualities do you need in order to get through a tough spot? That's not history. That's life. And today what we're going to do is we're going to look back. We're going to look back and see if we can identify, see if we can understand, see if we can tap into some of the qualities that our forefathers, the Jewish people who went through this tragedy, used in order to overcome, in order to move on. And perhaps by doing that, not only will we create an empathy with those people, but we will develop strategies, we'll think about ideas and approaches that maybe we can use in our own lives when we have come across a difficult patch. So let us begin. Here we're talking about the Day of Liberation, April 30th, 1945. The United States 7th Army, 45th Division, liberated Dachau concentration camp. And here are prisoners standing both inside and outside the barbed wire, waving at the camera. Now, I want to look at this picture for a minute, and I'd like us to analyze it. Are these people Jewish or not? Well, without knowing exactly who they are, I would venture to say they are not Jewish. And I'll tell you why. First of all, they're smiling. Second of all, they're waving. They seem to be able to summon from within themselves joy. After all, this is the day of their liberation. It wasn't easy for anybody in a concentration camp. It was miserable beyond misery. The Holocaust was the worst tragedy man has ever inflicted upon himself. Nevertheless, these people are able to muster within themselves the joy that must have been part and parcel of that day of liberation. And so too these people, right? These are iconoclastic pictures, right? Up in the in the top left corner, right? The Soviet, London, right? Trafalgar Square. It's Victory over Europe Day. And these people have what to be happy about. Their city had been bombed. They had lost people. They had suffered tremendously. And now it's over. Now it's over. And not only is it over, but the right side has won. There's nothing not to be happy about. Underneath that picture, we have members of the Soviet Union in Moscow celebrating and cheering the great victory over Hitler, who almost crushed their country. One of the worst conflicts to ever take place between one army and another was outside Stalingrad. It was a horrendous, horrendous experience, and they won. And of course, the iconoclastic picture that in Times Square, New York City, this sailor grabbing some nurse he didn't know. I'm sure she didn't know him. And the only appropriate response was a smooch. It was a great day. It was a great day for everybody in the world, almost. This was the day of liberation for this fellow also. Now, without knowing exactly who he is or where he came from, I can tell you is Jewish. Why? How do I know? Well, first off, if there's a picture that encapsulates pain, this is it. This man is bereft. This man is moaning on the day of his liberation. He survived the war. He survived. He survived to live and tell about it. But whom is he going to tell? He's got no family. He probably doesn't have any friends with him. He has no money. He has no country. He has no citizenship. He has no name. Often it was just a number. What does he have to look forward to? He survived. But so what? What does that mean to survive? Where is he going to go? What's he going to do? How is he going to be a person?
For those Jews who had survived the Holocaust, the fight to stay alive had tapped all their physical strength. In most cases, the survivors were weak and sick. Some were on the verge of death. Many were human skeletons. They had to be nursed slowly back to health and given desperately needed medical attention. Of those who made it to the moment of liberation, thousands died immediately afterwards.
But after it sank in, the freedom, I realized that where I was hoping the whole time that I will see my father, and maybe hope beyond hope my mother, although I knew that this is not a realistic hope.
Most of the survivors had to fight so hard just to stay alive that they didn't have the capacity or the ability to confront the fates of their loved ones. Up until liberation, many had expended all their energy on surviving from minute to minute. Now they realized that their entire families were gone. Their lives would never be the same. While the rest of the world was counting the dead, the Jews were counting the living.
Where I was elated by the freedom, there was tremendous fear. Who will I find? How will we survived this, but we have to go back to civilization. How will we react in a normal world again? We are here two young girls without anything. We were afraid we will have nobody. And we needed somebody that could spoil us, that could take care of us. We have to make a future for ourselves, and how will we make that future?
Father Edward P. Doyle. I was there, he writes, after the war. I was present. I saw the sights. I will never forget. You've heard the story many times before. On the night of April 11th, 1945, my division, of which I was the Catholic chaplain, took the town of Nordhausen. The following morning, with the dawn, we discovered a concentration camp. Immediately, the call went out for all medical personnel that could be spared to be present. On that morning in Nordhausen, I knew why I was there. I found the reason for it: man's inhumanity to man. What has happened to that beautiful commandment of the Decalogue, the commandment of God to love one another? Father Doyle was like so many other American troops. They didn't know what they were doing in Europe. It was a European war. Why were American boys there dying? It wasn't their problem. It wasn't their beef. Yet, when they came across the concentration camps, when they saw what they saw, to quote General Dwight D. Eisenhower, later President Eisenhower, they knew why they were there. All of a sudden, they understood that what they were doing wasn't simply fighting a war on foreign soil. They were the good fighting evil. They were the holy fighting the unholy. And when they celebrated in those pictures we saw at the beginning of this presentation, it wasn't just a celebration of winning a war. It was the defeat of evil. It was good triumphing over evil. And it brought a lot of hope to the world. But to the Jewish people, as you've heard, there was great trepidation. In full army uniform, Rabbi Schachter got down from his Jeep and stood before the pile of bodies. For those of you who may recognize the name J.J. Schachter, he is one of the rabbis from Yeshiva University. This is a testimony about his father, who helped liberate the concentration camps, in this case, Buchenwald. Many of them were still bleeding, some groaned in pain. Suddenly, he thought he saw a pair of eyes, wide open and alive. He panicked, and with the soldier's instinct, drew his pistol. Slowly, carefully, he began to circle the pile of bodies. Then, and this I recall clearly, he bumped into me, a little boy, staring at him from behind the mound of corpses, wide-eyed. His face revealed astonishment. In the midst of the killing field, in that sea of blood, suddenly a child appears. He holstered his pistol, then grabbed me with both hands and caught me in a fatherly embrace, lifted me in his arms, and in Yiddish, with a heavy American accent, he asked me, "Wie alt bist du, mein Kind?" How old are you, my boy? I saw tears dripping from his eyes. Still, through force of habit, I answered cautiously, like someone perpetually on guard. What difference does it make? At any rate, older than you. He smiled at me from behind his tears and asked, "What do you think? Why do you think you're older than I am?" Without hesitating, I replied, "Because you laugh and cry like a child, and I haven't laughed for a long time. I can't even cry anymore. So which one of us is older?" This is from Out of the Depth by Rabbi Israel Meir Lau, who is the head of Yad Vashem. One day, writes Antik Zuckerman, who survived the war, came to Israel and established Kibbutz Lochmei HaGetot in northern Israel. One day in January 1945, having spent several days listening to the music of the gunfire in Grodzisk near Warsaw, we were told that the Red Army tanks had reached the town marketplace. It seemed to me that the grief was never as great as on that joyous day. That day, January 17th, was the saddest day of my life. I wanted to weep, not from joy, but from sorrow. I'm not saying that I wept, but that I wanted to shed tears for the first time. Suddenly, we were faced with the desolation of the reckoning. What? Who? When all is said and done, there's a limit to the battle for life. We had lived all the time with a certain sense of mission, but now it was over. To what end? What purpose? Sivia had never seen me weep because I had never cried. Never, not even once, had they seen me downhearted. I had to live life to the fullest, But on January 17th, everything, it was not easy to be the last of the Mohicans. The realization of what their people, the Jewish people, had gone through, hit them only upon liberation. And it was a mighty blow. It was a blow perhaps greater than all the blows they had encountered during their captivity, during their torture, and during the death of thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and yes, millions of their brethren. This is Eva Brown. You met her before in the little video. She was the lady with the white hair who lamented so many years after this picture was taken that she needed someone to pamper her. Well, this is what she looked like, not on the day of liberation, but it looks like about a month after. Why do I say that? Because first she's smiling. And so far you've seen and heard from those who were liberated who didn't smile. She seems to have done her hair a bit. And standing behind her is another survivor who's still wearing the striped jackets of the survivors, of the prisoners, and she also seems to be smiling. There's an air of optimism, if you will, maybe. And Eva writes in her biography after the war what you heard her say, sort of paraphrase. She writes, all through the war we had prayed for liberation, and here it was suddenly. You're free. When I heard about freedom, I was also very frightened. How did one behave in a normal world? Worry about the future weighed heavily on me. We had to build a future. But how does one build a future? So maybe one of the qualities that we've seen amongst the people, the few people that we've heard from and that we've seen thus far, maybe one of those qualities that we should put in our back pocket and think about is the ability to look ahead. They were well aware of where they've been, and they were well aware of the pain that they experienced and went through. Yet, while they were frightened, and while they were sad, and while they were bereft of all they lost, nevertheless, they looked forward. They didn't forget, but nor did they dwell. They looked forward. It's a quality. Keep it. Chaim Rosenfeld, I remember only that I woke up to horrible screaming. I was liberated on April 28, 1945. Here begins my second tragedy. I didn't know who was still among the living and who was not. At the moment that they began to feel humanity in themselves, the first thing they did was they thought about all those whom they loved. And they know what they went through. And they were frightened for what those whom they loved went through. What was things like at Bergen-Belsen at liberation? Well, here's some basic statistics. 20,000 people out of, let's say, 30,000 liberated, 20,000 sick with dysentery and other intestinal diseases, 10,000 tuberculosis patients, 3,500 typhus patients, 75% people liberated required hospitalization. The mortality rate in the first weeks was 500 people per day. A horrible place. And what was their first and main concern? Food. Finally, they could eat like a human being. Bina Hauptmann was born July 4th, 1922 in Sosnowitz. She was taken for slave labor in the DWN weaving mill, Grunberg, in early 1942. On the 29th of January 1945, she was set on a 700-kilometer death march, from which she was liberated the 7th of May. She was considered Category 1, not likely to survive, but her strong constitution prevailed. Look at Bina Hauptmann. Look at her jawline, the empty, vacant look in her eyes. She was so weak, she couldn't lift her head off the pillow. But she did survive, though she was only skin and bones. On the third day after liberation, wrote Chaim Kuznitsky, a Red Cross car pulled up and a British officer got out. He told me that he would take me to a shower and give me clean clothes. Until then, I had been wearing the striped clothes of a katzetnik, a prisoner. I got in the car, which proceeded to a place I was not familiar with. There, I was given white bread with butter and jam and sweet cocoa. I ate as though I had never before tasted these things. It had been years since I had consumed such delicacies. Afterwards, I washed in a real shower with hot water and soap. They, the American soldiers, gave me a German army uniform to wear. The swastika was still sewn into the chest. I suddenly threw up all the marvelous food I had eaten earlier. The next morning, I could not even lift my head. My head felt so heavy that it seemed to be made of lead, and it hurt terribly. An ambulance arrived and took us to the hospital. In the hospital, they stripped me in order to wash me down, but I couldn't stand or even sit. They then put me on a scale, and the nurse who weighed me called out to her colleague, "Can you believe it? Only 28.5 kilos." That sentence rings in my ear to this day. Chaim Kuznitsky at Liberation was so depleted that he couldn't eat. He couldn't eat regular food, and he weighed approximately 60 pounds. Think about not taking for granted what we have so much of: a hot shower, food. It's an awareness that this testimony makes acute. Even though he couldn't handle it, you can taste the sweetness that he hadn't tasted, and you could feel the warmth of a shower that he hadn't felt in perhaps months and months. 60 kilo, 60 pounds, 28.5 kilo is what he weighed when he survived. People can't live like that, can't live at that weight. Once they ate, once they began to replenish their beaten and sorrowful bodies, the next question they had to ask is where to? Where can they go?
The journey through chaotic post-war Europe was very difficult. The trains weren't running, infrastructure had been damaged, refugees were jamming the roads. Some refugees journeyed hundreds of miles for weeks and weeks just to get home. One question we can ask is, what is home? Is it just a location? Why would they want to go home? They searched for what remained of their families and their communities in the familiar places in which they had once lived.
In Athens, I met a neighbor who had been with my brother at Yavorno camp. Right away, I asked him about my brother, and he made circles in the air with his finger, meaning my brother had been taken to the crematorium in Auschwitz. I almost passed out. I didn't know what to do with myself. I had thought that he was the only one who could have remained alive. He was strong. His name was Avraham, and from that day, no one came back.
They searched for what remained of their families and communities in those familiar places in which they had once lived. But when they got to those places, their families and their communities were gone. Home was no longer the image they had clung to during all the years of the war in order to survive. In some Eastern European countries, as many as 90% of the Jews had been murdered. According to one post-war survey, 3/4 of the survivors were the only survivor of their entire families. Survivors who managed to return to the places where they had once lived often had to confront hostile anti-Semitic reactions of the local populations, especially in Eastern Europe. For instance, on July 4th, 1946, in a place called Kielce, 42 Jews were murdered by their neighbors. As many as 1,500 Jews were murdered in Poland immediately after the war.
I went home. I didn't have anywhere I could stay. I had aunts and family. I went to see all their apartments. There were non-Jews living in every one. They wouldn't let me in. In one place, one of them said, "What did you come back for? They took you away to kill you. So why did you have to come back?" I decided, I'm not staying here, I'm going.
What are the numbers? Poland, 92% of the Jews were killed. In Soviet Union, 39%. Hungary, 79%. Romania, 65%. The Baltic countries, 90%. 86% in Germany, 94% in the Netherlands, 85% in Czechoslovakia, 30% in France, Italy, a remarkably low number, 19%. So one might think that an Italian Jew might have fared better. An Italian Jew might not have suffered this crushing disappointment after surviving the war, going home, only to find there was nothing left. There was no place for him to go, even when he got to the one place he knew. Primo Levi was such an Italian Jew. I came to Turin on October 19th, Turin in Italy, after a 35-day journey. The house was still standing. All the members of the family were alive. Nobody was expecting me. I was swollen, bearded, and dressed in rags. They could scarcely identify me. I found my friends full of life. Awaiting me were the warmth of a secure dining room, the reality of everyday routine, the intoxicating pleasure of writing. But it took me 2 months to abandon the habit of walking with my eyes fixed on the ground, as if seeking something to eat, or slip rapidly into my pocket to sell for bread. A terrifying dream still visits me from time to time. Of course, Primo Levi survived the war. He was a famous physicist, and he died. Some say perhaps he committed suicide. Others that he simply fell from an apartment. And he writes, however, that even though he was out of the camp was not out of him. Even though he had survived, surviving with him was this sense of being unsure, the sense of being unable to fully appreciate what he now had because he was afraid someone would take it away. These are scars that he said he passed in 2 months, but others never passed them. They had these scars, these fears, this inability to completely shake what they had experienced. Nevertheless, they tried. Maybe the second quality, the first of course was looking ahead. Maybe the second is hope. They were always hoping. They were hoping they would find their family. They were hoping that they would get over what they had experienced. They were hoping they allowed themselves to dream the next stage. For many, if not most, they didn't have the luxury that Primo Levi had by being able to go to his home. They had no home, as we saw. So they went to DP camps, displaced person camps. What was life like there? Well, the life in the DP camps surrounded and revolved around one thing predominantly, and that was trying to become normal again, or creating a connection to what existed beforehand. Life in the DP camps was to a large extent a life for continuity.
And then came 1939, and the sun set on the Jewish world of Europe. Devastation, destruction, and desolation. And yet after the war, slowly and painstakingly, the Jewish nation began to rejuvenate, and with it, the Daf Yomi.
After Auschwitz, Sachsenhausen, Oranienburg, Ohrdruf, and Buchenwald, we celebrated, together with a small group of survivors of Sheikhs Apleitiyiden, celebrated the third Siyum HaShas, which none of us participated in or learned it. Maybe a little bit in the ghettos, but certainly not in the concentration camps. DP camp of Feldafing, where I was, they assembled and they celebrated. They had 3 Gemaras nidder, and about 4 Mesechtes, 5 Mesechtes, brachas, in order to have scholar to start the 4th Machzor of Daf Yomi. And of course, those Jews who were chalashing to see Yiddish oasis again and to learn, they grabbed it. And it so happened that to the Siyum, to the Mesiba itself, they brought these 3 Gemaras and a few Gemaras brachas. And here we started again.
Daf Yomi was one of the great unifying programs amongst the Jewish people in pre-war Europe. In the 1920s, Rav Meir Shapiro, who was then the Rav of Pietrkov, later the city that Rav Lau's father was the Rav of, the first ghetto in Poland, he established the idea that all the Jews in the world should learn the same page of Talmud every day, one page a day. And that way, when people traveled around, because at that time, international travel was becoming less and less rigorous, more and more possible. To travel by sea was not unheard of. To go from Europe to the United States it still wasn't common, but it wasn't an impossible dream. And he felt that there needed to be a common language among Jews. And so he instituted this idea called Daf Yomi, which you might recall was just celebrated last year in New York. Hundreds of thousands of Jews celebrated the completion of another cycle of the Talmud, one page at a time. It takes 7.5 years. Well, the war in America, they kept learning it. Of course, the people who went through the war, maybe in the ghettos, they could learn a little bit now and then, but certainly not in the camps. At the end of the war, 1946, they celebrated another completion of the cycle. And here, these people who weren't able to participate in the program during the war, nevertheless, they celebrated. Why? Because they needed continuity. The Daf Yomi is a supreme example of how they many people immediately plugged into all that existed for them prior to the war, that had been lost in the war, and now they were determined to re-establish in their lives. Now, a big part of that was restoring faith. I'd like you to look at this picture for a minute. It's a fascinating picture. Here it's two children smiling. They seem to be happy. The girl, the older one, is still wearing a prisoner's uniform. The boy seems to be healthy, well-fed. And they're letting a soldier, an American soldier, put a shoe on. Now, it seems like a cute picture, but there's more to it. There's a depth to it. You see, for these young kids, a man in a uniform that they didn't know meant death. It meant fear. It meant destruction, right? Who knows what they saw men in uniform doing to their family? They survived the war, and they survived with an incredible distrust of men in uniform. Yet, with time, their faith in humanity began to be restored. They moved ahead. Not only did they look ahead, not only did they have hope, but they refused to allow themselves to be defined by their tragedy. And they began to reestablish in their lives not only the continuity from before the war, but actual faith, the ability to trust another human being. So here you see this fantastic picture of trust coming to fruition, and this young girl allowing this strange man to help her. Perhaps not the end of the story, just the beginning. But nevertheless, it's a fantastic picture. This is going to be one of the most remarkable clips you've ever seen. It was taken by the British Army upon their liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp.
The day I reached Belsen concentration camp, the 5th day of liberation, was a Friday, the day before the Jewish Sabbath. Something like half the surviving prisoners at Belsen were Jews, and the Jewish chaplain to the British Second Army, the Reverend L.H. Hardman, held an eve of the Sabbath service in the open air in the midst of the camp. It was the first Jewish service that many of the men and women present had taken part in for 6 years. It was probably the first Jewish service held on German soil in absolute security and without fear for a decade. Around us lay the corpses that there had not been time to clear away even after 5 days. 40,000 or more had been cleared, but there were still 1,000 or 2,000 around. People were still lying down and dying in broad daylight in front of our eyes. This was the background to this open-air Jewish service. During the service, the few hundred people gathered together were sobbing openly, with joy at their liberation, and with sorrow at the memory of their parents and brothers and sisters that had been taken from them and gassed and burned. These people knew they were being recorded. They wanted the world to hear their voice. They made a tremendous effort, which quite exhausted them. Listen. The children of Israel still liveth.
Amen. They refused to be snuffed out. Not only did they have hope, but if you saw, they brought the children, not their children, any children they could find, children who had survived not understanding, only knowing that life was full of starvation and death and cruelty. They brought the children into the circle, because they immediately realized on the 5th day of liberation that the future was the children. And those children had to be brought up in a world of security, in a world of kindness, in a world where they could be normal. So they refused to wallow in their pain. They looked forward. They refused to vanquish hope. And they in fact hoped. And then they began by bringing the children into the circle. Yet another quality that they employed to get through everything they had to get through was action. By bringing those children into the circle, they had started the first step towards the rest of their lives, not just for them, but for the future of their people, the Jewish people. It's a remarkable video.
Their thirst for knowledge is amazing. One fact is worthy of mention. Not a single pupil is late for class. They come without breakfast because the canteens open at 8:30, while school begins at 8. Anyone who is aware of the sensitivity to hunger of the former Kotsetniks will appreciate their devotion to studies.
For many survivors, culture and education were very important. We can ask, why were they so important when for many of these people food was still scarce, they were still in mourning, and the future was still very uncertain? For many of them, culture was what represented the bridge between their former lives. It connected them to their previous traditions. It was also a way to escape their reality. Education was the key to their futures. For instance, survivors in the DP camps published more than 70 newspapers. They had film screenings, they established sports clubs, there were theaters, there was art, there was culture. They also established schools to give the children whose lives had been interrupted vocational and educational training. In addition, they began commemoration projects. The camps were full of posters everywhere to make people aware of all these activities. The atmosphere was the opposite of the desperation and the awful uncertainty that the survivors of the Holocaust had been living with. As a matter of fact, the atmosphere was one of a frenzy of activity, as though these people were trying to make up for all the time they had lost. Survivors who were alone tried to make new human connections. They reached out for other survivors who instinctively understood the trauma and the loss they had experienced without having to discuss it too much.
People got married, and they would take a hut and divide it into 10 tiny rooms for 10 couples. The desire for life overcame everything. After such destruction, to build a new life, to get married, to bring children into the world, in the ability to forget lay the ability to create a new life.
There was an astonishing number of marriages in the DP camps, sometimes as many as 6 every day. And after the marriages came children. In fact, the survivors' birth rate was higher than anywhere else in the world. In the Bergen-Belsen camp alone, 555 babies were born in 1946. And by 1948, the camp was celebrating the birth of the 1,000th baby. All of these things were manifestations of the survivors' drive to live, and not only to live, but also to create new life. They were building a future.
They used their time in the DP camps to progress, to take steps forward, even to get married. And to marriage, by definition, is the dream of a future. Here you have an invitation. I translated it for you. We're happy to invite all our friends to participate in our day of happiness. Menashe, Ben, Reb, Raphael, Schwarzan, and Golda, Bas, Evner, Bas, Aram, Pesach, Evner. They'll take place at such a time, right, in Bergen-Belsen. On the bride's side, Malka Evner, the bride's mother in Belsen. Who are these people? Well, here's their wedding picture. So they got married, but you see the mother sitting in the front and the bride and the groom, but look around. There's no older people. It was friends who got together to celebrate these two people, the groom and the bride, who were not only not wallowing, not only exercising hope, but actually taking steps to realize a better future, as difficult as that might be. You know, we think when we talk about these qualities that I'm talking about to you, that it came easy. Just so you see that every step was a struggle, please listen to this testimony. It is also a remarkable testimony.
שקלתי 28 קילו, ואחותי שקלה 29. אבל ככה לאט לאט אנחנו עברנו, ואני ששקלתי 38 קילו, הלכתי לבית חולים על זה, ועבדתי בבית חולים. 8-10 שעות, קשה עבדתי, וחזרתי לעצמי ככה. אז בלילה אחת, הייתי בתורנות לילה ושמעתי שחולה אחד נורא צורח. אני רואה את החולה הזה עם שתי עיניים כחולות ובלורית בלונדינית כזאת, בחור כזה יפה. עוד לא היה לי רגש בין אישה וגבר, רק זה היה מין התעוררות כזאת. וככה התחיל הרומן, ואחר כך הוא דיבר עוד בבית חולים שהוא יוצא כבר, אנחנו נתחתן. הוא רוצה להתחתן איתי. בסדר. אז נתנו לנו 2 פתקאות לקבל בגדים, לא לקבל חליפה, ולי, לחתונה. אז צריך משהו על הראש. אז הולכת לקופת חולים ואני אומרת, אחות תראי, אני מתחתנת, אולי יש לך איזושהי תחבושת גדולה, אפילו 2 חתיכות, 3 חתיכות, אני אתפור אותם, אחבר אותם ויעשה לי. היא אומרת, אני הולכת לחפש, היא הולכת והיא באה, היא אומרת, את יודעת, יש לך מזל, אני מצאתי תחבושת 1 מטר על 1 מטר, זה יהיה לך טוב, יופי. בשעה 6 הייתה החופה שלנו. אני לקחתי שושבינים הונגרים, אברהם לקח שושבינים פולנים. זה היה מסודר, סולידריות. כן, אחר כך.
ביום הזה מה
שאנחנו התחתנו.
7 זוגות.
7 זוגות התחתנו באותו היום.
אנחנו היינו ראשונים.
כבר לא היינו לבד. היה לי בעל, אז לא היינו כבר לבד. אחרי המלחמה, הרי לנו לבחורות לא היה וסת במלחמה, וגם אחרי המלחמה. אני התחתנתי, אז נכנסתי להיריון, לא ידעתי אפילו שאני בהיריון. עוד לא היה לי חזה, אז פתאום שבהיריון גדל לי החזה. הלכתי לרופא נשים, וככה סתם אני אומרת, דוקטור תראה, מה זה? הוא בודק אותי, הוא אומר, את יודעת, את בהיריון בחודש שלישי. אני קפצתי מהשולחן כמו משוגע. דוקטור, אני בהיריון? הוא אומר לי, את לא נשואה? אני כן נשואה, אבל אני לא רוצה ילד. דוקטור, תעשה לי הפלה. אני לא רוצה ילד. אני לא יכולה, לא מסוגלת לשמוע בכי של תינוק. אני שמעתי באושוויץ את התינוקות, את הצריחות. אני לא רוצה, וכל כך בכיתי.
אני לא ידעתי מזה.
הוא לא ידע מזה. אבל אני אשלם לך. תציל אותי, אני לא רוצה ילד. אם אין לך כסף, הוא אמר, אני לא עושה הפלה. באתי הביתה, לקחתי מגבת רטובה, הרטפתי מגבת, לקחתי מגהץ, הכנסתי לתקע, שמתי את המגבת על הבטן והתחלתי לגהץ. הייתי יכולה לעשות מהתינוק הזה איזשהו משהו. והרמתי ארונות והרמתי מה שיכולתי רק. וזה לא הלך בשום אופן. לא הלך בשום אופן. ושהבן שלי נולד, שהביאו לי אותו, אז שראיתי אותו נפש חיה וחשבתי איך אני רציתי להרוג אותו, איך אני אחר כך חייתי כל הזמן עם המחשבה הזאת, וכל הזמן התפללתי שאלוהים יתרום לי אותו שלא יחולה. אצלנו נולד הבן הראשון, ובשבוע ימים היו 7 ילדים.
Sometimes when you move forward from a difficult situation, you can't wait until everything is perfect. You can't wait until you're always perfectly ready. They got married. She wasn't ready to have a baby. She was frightened. She had bad memories. Who knows what she saw in the camps that had to, all of a sudden she found that she had one and she panicked. She tried to abort it. She tried to hurt it. She tried to get rid of it somehow. Thank God she was not successful. And then she had the baby and she learned to love the baby and she learned to be a good mother, not without difficulty, not without fears, not without those things you've heard about from survivors, right? I'm the child of a survivor. You know, my father's relationship to food, to waste, to waiting. And he had issues. They had issues, but they didn't allow those issues to prevent them from moving ahead, from leaving the pain and moving towards a better life. Dorothy Finger wrote, "A very special moment in my life was the first time that I saw the lights of New York. It was night and the weather was pleasant. We went on deck and looked at the wonderful lights of a free country, the happiness that I hadn't had for years. I was happy. I looked back to Europe, which seemed to me so gloomy, filled with tears that I had left behind. And I saw before me a land with a promising future. I believed. I thought it was utopia, but it was really New York. I think it was the happiest day of my life." Even though she didn't fully know what to expect, just the fact that she was able to move to a place that wasn't drowning in her own tears gave her hope and gave her great happiness. I'd like to show you one other video that incorporates the hatikva that we saw in Bergen-Belsen. But this is in a different state people who were much more developed, not the fifth day, but later, several years later. Oh.
In the fall of 1946, David Ben-Gurion comes to Germany to inspect the situation for himself. Rabbi Friedman is asked to take him around the camps.
And I said to him, what you have to do, if I may be presumptuous, what you have to do is try to lift the morale. And so he got up there. They were all standing. We didn't have seats. There were 5,000 people in the camp by now. He spoke to them in Hebrew for a few minutes. This sentence I remember clearly. I come to you with empty pockets. And he took his pockets of his trousers and pulled them out, you know, inside out, to show them that they were empty, had nothing there. I have no certificates to give you. That meant I cannot take you to Palestine in a legal way. Therefore, I have to ask you for patience, and I have to ask you to have hope. Because we want you, we need you, and then he went on in a beautiful way to give them the feeling that they were going to be able to contribute to the building of the future state. And our song is hope. Hatikva is a song, the Hebrew word means hope. Now let's all sing Hatikva. Now he couldn't sing. And I have a monotone as far as singing is concerned. The two of us were up there totally disarmed. I mean, how I said to myself, oh, if we only had somebody who could start this song. But the song started from among the people. And slowly but surely the volume grew and grew, and it came to a great crescendo. During the song, he started to cry. He wasn't going to say anymore. He didn't say anymore. But he was touched. And every time I think of that, I am also. We left the camp, we got in a car and went to the city, to the hotel. He said, they will have patience, they will have weight, and we'll build the country on them.
What happened to so many survivors is they were pursuing their desire to create life. They're clinging to hope as they activated their feelings and moved forward, constantly forward. They began to inspire others. And that success in dealing with their own issues slowly turned into an inspiration to those who were around them.
Survivors immigrated to all parts of the world, with the majority of them reaching and settling in the United States and in Israel. Wherever they went, they contributed to the societies in which they settled. For Jewish survivors, the end of the war was merely the beginning of a difficult journey. They needed to adapt to living with the scars of loss and the memories that they would continue to carry with them. Though some survivors never recovered from the trauma of the Holocaust, most of them managed to build a new life.
The man, you see the group of kids on the right, and then there's a man with a red tie. That's my father. Of course, that's me. I'm the next guy over. That's my wife and my daughters and my children and some of my grandchildren. My father's a survivor. And I often think at the end of the war, when he had lost everything, his family, his home, his country. Could he have imagined, could he ever have imagined that not only would he survive, but he would have a family, I and my brother, and from that family would come scores of grandchildren, scores and scores of grandchildren living in Israel, in a Jewish country. I often wonder if he could have imagined it, but then I stop myself. And I realize the only reason I'm here and my children and my grandchildren is because he did imagine it. He didn't let his pain define him. So my friends, I appreciate you letting me come and share some thoughts with you. You know, we in Yad Vashem in Israel, we do this every day. And people often ask me, how do you do it? How do you constantly recall such difficult things? And you can see, I apologize, even though I do this on a regular, every day, this is the third one I've done today, it's still often difficult for me. And I do it because I believe b'chol levavi, with my entire heart, that the world needs to hear it. Because so many of the qualities of these people who survived, who went through hell, so many of those qualities are important today. They're important for us because we also have things that we have to get through, not the Holocaust, but our lives. Nothing is simple. And therefore, maybe, hope against hope, maybe we can learn from these heroes and make our lives, and more importantly, the lives of our children and grandchildren, maybe just a little bit better. Thank you very, very much.
Rabbi Cohn, I know I speak for all of our attendees and those of us who plan this event in thanking you so very much for this very heartwarming and very intellectual and poignant and meaningful presentation. From the bottom of our hearts, for everybody out there, we so thank everyone for joining us today. You know, what has been so fascinating is that since we started inviting people, our community has been sharing with us stories, and we encourage the continued sharing of those stories so that we can share them amongst ourselves. We got a number of questions, but I'm just going to ask one, and that is, you know, in this age of seeming increasing anti-Semitism and short attention spans, you know, it's very easy for people, and you know, they may know about the Holocaust, but it's easy to sort of shut the door and keep it locked away. What is how do we as Jews make sure that the world knows about the Holocaust and these same lessons and emotions that we feel? How can we do our best to share that with the non-Jewish world, in which we're such a small and precious minority?
Excellent question. You know, there was a Dr. Gilbert who was associated with the American Army, who was in Nuremberg and was responsible to interview the top Nazis who were on trial in Nuremberg. And he did that because the Americans wanted a psychological study. But in addition, he was himself personally, he was making a study. He was working on his PhD on evil. What is the source of evil? And he studied, and at the end, after the trials, he wrote that the quality that all of those perpetrators had was they lacked empathy. They lacked empathy. They couldn't feel for anything or anyone other than themselves. When we study the Holocaust, we study it to teach empathy, because the Holocaust is not about the destruction of 6 million. It's a story about people. people just like us, just like our non-Jewish neighbors. We eat, we laugh, we have children, we love our children, we worry about our parents, we worry about the mortgage, we worry about all sorts of things, right? We're people and they're people through education, not massive education about numbers that we can't imagine, but stories about people, stories about struggles, stories about universal values. I believe, I hope, I pray that we can instill in the world, in our non-Jewish neighbors and friends, empathy. Not only empathy for what we went through, but empathy one to the other. And I believe that if we keep trying, it won't be easy. It hasn't been easy, but we're not ready to give up, that we might be successful in making the world a better place. I hope that answers the question a little bit.
That does, and we had one more question come in, and thank you for that. What sort of anecdotally, how many survivors didn't want to talk about their experiences, wanted to keep it locked away, put it in the past, and how do we sort of be, to speak about the Holocaust and educate ourselves and our children and those around us without feeling this sense of shame and victimization that is just completely natural to feel?
Okay. First of all, Jews were not victims. We're not victims. We never were victims, right? Never before in the world had a people been accosted without a reason. We weren't fighting for land. We weren't trying to overthrow a government. We had no army. We had no guns. We had nothing. And all of a sudden, civilization as we knew it turned on us. What should we have done? Should we have expected people to march in the streets and take a bullet? It wasn't back in the 30s when Hitler came to power. It wasn't like today where you had mass media that covers protests. It was inconceivable what was going on. The fact that we refused to be dehumanized, the fact that we held on to our values, the fact that we started new lives shows that we resisted perhaps in the most incredible and effective way. In addition, we fought. We fought tanks and planes with Molotov cocktails and rocks. And even though we didn't win the battle, we won the war. We're sitting here right now. So I think we have to disavow this idea that we were victims. Now we can sit with our children because now we have a great legacy to teach our children. The legacy of internal strength, the legacy of being optimistic to a fault, the legacy of being willing to see the good in people when it was difficult. We couldn't believe what was going on because we couldn't believe human beings were possible. That's a great legacy in a time where sometimes the world seems so not caring. We can be proud. We can be enthusiastic, and we should, again, teach the stories of the people to our children so that they can be proud. It's their legacy as much as it is anybody's.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, everybody. This is Andrea Weiss, and we're thrilled to have had so many people join us and their outpouring of emotion and enthusiasm for our event. Since we started this event, within just 1 week, we've had so many heartwarming stories about survivors, long-lost relatives, found through the Yad Vashem archives. And please keep sharing with us. We want to build a community of Holocaust learning and memory. Follow Yad Vashem USA on social media. Mark your calendar for November 8th, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everybody. God bless, and thank you again, Rabbi Cohn, and everybody at Yad Vashem.